With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us on the AgNet News Hour this morning. I am Sabrina Halvorson, and joining me is co-host Lorrie Boyer. Good morning, Lorrie.
Well, a very good morning. Thank you.
Did you have a great Christmas?
I had an excellent Christmas. How about you?
Yeah, it was fantastic. Nice and peaceful, just the way that I like it. You know how it is once you're an empty nester, and we didn't travel anywhere this year, so we just kind of stayed home, and it was really quiet and peaceful. I'm getting used to that. At first, it was really hard and almost heartbreaking for me to just have the empty nester Christmas, but I'm getting used to it. Now I see it as
Aw.
being relaxing and peaceful.
Yeah, I'm an empty nester, but I'm not sure how relaxing and peaceful it was back and forth. But I'm not complaining, and overall not real far traveling. So didn't have to deal
Right.
with all the airports and things like that.
Right. Thank goodness. Oh my gosh. Holiday travel is just crazy. So, okay, while we're talking about crazy things, I want to bring up today's topic because I kind of feel like this comes from the you can't please everybody file. There are several environmental groups that are suing California air regulators over their recent update of the climate program. And the environmental groups are saying that the air regulators failed to address the pollution impacts of biofuels. Okay, so now years ago, biofuels were all the thing. We had to do this to save the planet. Now biofuels are not good enough either.
Yeah.
It,
So it is interesting because biofuels we typically think of as clean fuels. We typically think of using more natural sources when it comes to biofuels. But,
Mhm.
I think you and I probably have heard this all along that there's still a cost to the environment, even when it comes to manufacturing biofuels.
Right, right. And there is, in many ways, there are a lot of ways that biofuels really are not the savior for the environment that they once were thought to be. Um, with what it takes to create the actual fuels. We're talking about the things that are used for biofuels, like different vegetables, crops, and things like that. It takes, there is a cost to the environment to grow these things and then to turn them from corn or whatever into the biofuel there as well. There again a cost to the environment. So these environmental groups are saying instead they want to focus on the charging infrastructure for zero emission vehicles. Essentially, they want to have more charging for electric vehicles. And I can see how that makes sense. I don't know that we're there yet.
Now, this might just be helpful, I think, for me and then for our listeners as we continue on with our conversation. A biofuel, I looked up this definition. A biofuel is a fuel that is derived from biomass, such as plant, algae, or animal material or waste. It's considered renewable energy because it can be replenished more quickly than fossil fuels. Fossil fuels would be considered oil, coal, and natural gas. Biofuels can be used directly, such as wood logs, or it can be processed into liquid or gas forms. So I thought that was helpful here today as we talk about that. Now, here's the funny thing to me. Okay, so I understand about investing more in charging infrastructure, and that definitely is an issue across the country, but especially here in California, it's what we're talking about in our future electric vehicle mandates and such. But it costs a lot of money to create infrastructure. And not only that, but there is definitely a cost to the environment when it comes to creating the infrastructure like charging stations, along with the cost to the environment in even manufacturing the batteries and the different technologies that are needed for them.
Right. I was speaking with an expert one time, and for the life of me, I cannot remember who it is, but he made an excellent point that we are calling these zero emission vehicles when in fact, none of these vehicles are actually zero emissions. There is an emission cost for every vehicle that's made just in the manufacturing process. And like you said, to make their batteries is actually harmful for the environment as well. So the term itself, zero emission vehicle, is a misnomer. That's not actually what they are. A lower emission vehicle, sure, or let's just flat out call them electric vehicles because that's what they are. I don't know why we've become politically correct in the
Right.
terminology. Why don't we just call it what it is? It's an electric car. And I have a story that I wanted to share from when I was at the CAPCA event in Anaheim back in October. And I took an Uber somewhere. I don't remember where I was going, but the Uber driver had an electric car. And I was asking him how he liked it. I drive a 2012 Chevy Impala. So I don't drive an electric car. I don't even drive one of the hybrids or whatever. I'm lucky my car is still going. But uh, I was asking him how he liked his electric car, and he was not happy. And we're in Anaheim. He's an LA person. His problem was, and it kind of speaks to what the environmental groups are saying, but his issue was that there are not enough places to charge his vehicle. So he can charge it at home when he plugs in and then charges all night long. It takes at least 8 hours, he said, for him to get a full charge. So he can charge while he's sleeping, and that's fine. But then when he's out driving around, if he needs a charge, it is extremely difficult for him to be able to find one because there are not enough charging stations out for the public to use. There are charging stations at grocery stores and at gas stations and other places you can find charging stations, but there are already so many electric vehicles on the streets that the charging places are always full. And so it's when you're out running around, it's hard to keep a charge on your car. And so I see the need, absolutely see the need for more charging stations, but is that where we're at this moment? Is that what we need to be focusing on at this moment?
Yeah, definitely a good point. Good story. I've heard almost the exact same type of story from other people. And since we're on that, just a couple little notes, and then I know we can get back to this article. But there's also some ramifications on electric vehicles for smaller communities. For example, I interviewed a farmer in the Midwest in the Illinois area, and a couple of things. He's on the volunteer fire department. Well, there was an electric vehicle in his area that caught on fire. Once they got out there, they didn't have the correct fire retardant to even be able to use on an electric vehicle and an electric vehicle battery. And that would cost that community a lot of money to have that fire retardant. And B, they couldn't use the jaws of life because it would electrocute the rescue workers. So
Oh
there
my
are a
gosh.
lot of issues. They ended up having to bury it, literally bury it under dirt and sand to take care of it. I'm assuming they got the person out. He didn't say whether or not it was a fatality, to be honest with you, but there's all
Yeah.
kinds of those little things that we're not thinking about.
No. Oh my gosh, that's so interesting. I want to chat about that more. We do need to take a quick break here. We'll continue on this topic when we get back. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. She is Lorrie Boyer, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. We are chatting about electric vehicles versus biofuels today, and it's an interesting conversation, but I would love to take a closer look at which is actually better when you consider all the things we've been talking about, the environmental impacts of making the vehicles, the environmental impacts of making the batteries versus the environmental impacts of making the biofuels or growing the fuel, the fuel items that are needed for it. But also vegetable oil. You remember when vegetable oil was all the craze and people were wanting to convert
Yeah.
their cars into, to be able to pour their used vegetable oil into the cars? Gosh, how long ago was that?
Well, not all that long ago, I actually personally know farmers that go and collect it. They still do. They go and
Yeah.
collect it from restaurants and use it in their machinery, actually, on their farms.
Yeah. So talking about farms, this conversation has been brought up quite a bit in any agricultural circle that's discussing electric vehicles. But even in California, they want the farm vehicles to be electric vehicles. And I still am having a very difficult time wrapping my head around how this is going to work. How are you? I mean, it's so easy when you have to stop and refuel your vehicle, your combine, whatever. You go and refuel, but to have to plug it in, to stop work
Right.
and plug it in for several hours at a time, that to me just doesn't seem feasible on a farm.
Yeah, no, that's one of the biggest arguments right now is that, and you and I have even talked about in the past, autonomy in general too, and just
Hmm.
kind of feeding into this conversation, I think there is a lot of questions on, what are the dangers of having these batteries out in the middle of a field? If you're in a drier area, you're in a dry field, there's a lot of safety concerns. It could catch on fire, things like that.
Yeah. Right, exactly. And then speaking of fire, also, like you were talking about just before the break, safety concerns for the vehicle itself, because, water is an extreme concern for electric vehicles. And I don't know, what are the safety issues on the farm?
Yeah, yeah, there's big questions. And I know there's a lot of think tanks out there, a lot of academia that are actually looking into this. And I've done a few interviews off and on that. I don't think anyone has a conclusion because it is so new and it takes a while to research it. And there's different issues with different parts of the country with all of this too.
Right. Right. It's an interesting story. It's an interesting path that we're kind of watching as it continues on. I know that the California Air Resources Board just voted, I believe in November, to increase the state's emission reduction targets. They are funding charging infrastructure for more of these electric vehicles and trying to phase out incentives for capturing methane emissions from dairy farms. So there's a lot of action being taken. I'm not sure all of it is, pro agriculture, but
Yeah.
then we are in California and we're not exactly known for being always pro agriculture. I know that, our ag secretary, who I like quite a bit, I really like Secretary Ross, and she does a great job for agriculture. But sometimes with all of these different environmental groups directing things with lawsuits and things, it can be very tough for our farmers out here and everything that they're going through.
I find this interesting going back to our where we started when we were talking about the environmental lawsuits against biofuels and the hazards they create. So this is according to an AP article. One of the groups, the group is name is Communities for a Better Environment, is talking about people who live near the biofuel refineries are harmed by the expansion of polluting biofuels. So it's funny because when I read that definition, biofuels are supposed to come from all natural sources. So it's just, to me, it is so contrary
Mhm.
to what we think biofuels are and what they're supposed to do. And then we have this happening. I'm not denying that it's not happening. It's just so contradictory to me on what we talk about, what the goals are, what the messages are that are out there with regard to biofuels.
Right, and that's been the whole like for years we've been hearing about how much better biofuels are for you, for us humans, for the environment, for the animals. And now to have the environmental group saying, "Nope, sorry, they're not." We need to change focus again. And I'm a science person. I believe we should understand that science changes. Just because we understood one thing in science one day does not mean that it's going to be the same. That's the thing about science. It is always changing and growing as we learn more. And it's important to be open to that, to understand that science, yes, science changes. Science does not stay the same. If a scientific fact stays the same forever, then it actually is not necessarily a scientific fact. We have to understand that as we learn more, we grow more and understand things in different ways. But this one is troubling for me now that biofuels are taking all the heat.
I am a science person as well, and I consider myself a realist. I think part of the issue, the overall issue, is the science cannot keep up with the changes. And once you start a research project, it takes a little while. And then before you know it, something else has already changed. I think
Right.
that is just part of the whole grand scheme of things in general.
Well, while we continue to try to figure this out, we do need to take another quick break. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. She's Lorrie Boyer. This is the AgNet News Hour, and we'll be right back. This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. How do humates, and specifically those produced by Live Earth Products, help with greenhouse gas emissions in farming practices?
So the interesting thing is that I like to say it's unique to us, but it's not. Humates and organic matter do a very interesting and very important task in the soil, and that is retain nitrogen. Now, what happens is when farmers apply nitrogen, not all of it is obviously used by the plant, and so some of that nitrogen is lost in multiple ways. It's lost, volatilized, mineralized, or converted. And what happens is some of those converted gases are released as very potent greenhouse gases. And so by the organic nature of humic acids and humates, it helps stabilize that nitrogen and reduce those conversions. Therefore, you get less of those gases created. Now, what's interesting is there's a double dip here, because a lot of times these nitrogen products are created through a process called the Haber-Bosch process. That Haber-Bosch process relies on fossil fuels to create those and fix those nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So by reducing your nitrogen utilization, you also reduce those carbon emissions that are created during the creation of that fertilizer. It's a double dip. You save the fertilizer that you're applying, and you're also reducing your carbon footprint by reducing nitrogen loss.
So, with that in mind, tell me a little bit about what exactly Live Earth does.
So typically farmers were using our humates or our liquid humic acids with their nitrogen products. And what that does, it helps stabilize that nitrogen, let that plant get a longer opportunity to use that before that nitrogen is lost, volatilized, or converted. And the technology is not unique just to nut crops. It's used with every nitrogen product. We've got some really neat university trials using our humic acid with a liquid UAN32, and it's a liquid nitrogen it can be lost in the nature just due to inefficiencies and poor storage in the soil.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Lorrie Boyer.
Today, my guest is Brian Little, Chief Operating Officer for Farm Employer Labor Service, which is an affiliated company of the California Farm Bureau. Tell me about yourself here, Brian, to get us started.
I did about 20 years in Washington, D.C. before I came to California. While I was there, I was a Senior Director for Governmental Affairs with American Farm Bureau, working on transportation policy, regulatory policy, and HR and employment issues for them. Then I moved into the Bush administration in 2001. And while I was at the Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor, I served as a Congressional Relations Officer, working with Federal OSHA, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, and the immigration functions of the Department of Labor, which your listeners who are familiar with the H-2A program will know what the labor certification procedure is all about. Because if they use the H-2A program, they've experienced that in the past and probably didn't like it. And then after that, I wound up coming to California to do the public policy stuff related to HR and employment in California specifically. So I work a lot with the legislature, with the regulatory agencies like the Cal OSHA Standards Board and the Ag Labor Relations Board, some of those folks. And then I also run Farm Employers Labor Service, which is an affiliated company of California Farm Bureau. And what we do at FELS, we have 6 employees, including myself. We work to provide tools and information and assistance to agricultural employers to help them understand and execute all of the many, many things that the state and the federal government want them to do in their capacity as agricultural employers, and it's a lot. And we've been at this since about 1970. I succeeded the guy who succeeded the founder in 2009 doing this, and we are working every day. I do a newsletter. We do products like our laminated compliance posters, which a lot of your listeners have probably seen, if I had to guess. And then I have 4 field staff who work out in the field on a one-on-one basis with their clients and with their employees and their supervisors, helping them be better at being agricultural employers and be better at supervisors, and helping them do things like heat illness prevention training and tractor safety training and forklift training and things of that nature. So providing services directly to ag employers at their places of employment. So I think that's pretty much the 7-minute elevator talk.
Wow, I have so many things in there. I'd love to do some spin-off interviews with you. The H-2A program comes up all the time. And today we're going to be talking about bird flu and creating a proactive bird flu mitigation plan. Where do we start with this here, Brian?
I haven't fully developed the plan. I'm still working on it. Developed a plan to try to help small ag producers, small dairy operators cope with the zoonotic disease standard and the things that they're expected to do in order to cope with that. Right now, what I've been trying to do mostly is pushing information out to dairy operators and Farm Bureau members so that they understand what the basic requirements are for protecting employees if they are, both of them not yet experiencing an infection of H5N1, And once they do experience one, and everybody I've talked to are saying it really isn't a question of whether, just when it's going to happen, that they can understand what the appropriate personal protective equipment and protocols are to try to protect their employees, and then to figure out if they do have infected animals to refer them to resources through Cal OSHA to help get them to the right place so that they can see what it is they need to do. And it's a lot. The agency thinks that the zoonotic disease standard is simple and easy to understand. God bless them, it is not anything. It's anything but that. And back in the summertime, when we first started seeing bird flu cases in California, I was very concerned about the recommendations that CDC and CDPH were making at the time about the suite of PPE that they were expecting ag employees who were in contact with animals. And for the most part, when you're dealing with an infected flock, the answer to the problem is you depopulate your flock. You can't really do that with dairy cattle. And so you're going to have ongoing contact with cows when they become infected with H5N1, whether you're just taking care of them by drenching them or taking care of them while they're sick. I don't think that most dairy operators are even trying to have a hospital barn because the whole freaking herd is going to be infected at some point. And so employees, the ones that have direct contact with cows, the ones who are milking cows before they become so sick that they don't give any milk anymore, and then dealing with them, drenching them, and otherwise caring for them after that. And then the ones who are going to be caring for them, trying to get them back into the cycle of lactating and giving milk again, you're going to want to make sure that you have adequate PPE and adequate protocols to deal with that. And that's things like potentially having the full suite of PPE, but that full suite of PPE was going to be very problematic when it was 101 degrees outside. We were in a position that I was concerned we were going to lose more milkers and cow pushers to heat illness than we would ever lose to H5N1. And I think the important insight about H5N1 is that you have to balance your hazards. And when it was 105 degrees outside, that was a tricky thing to do. Now that it's not so hot and you can give people PPE, things like waterproof smocks and suits and booties and gloves and face shields and bouffant caps to try to keep them from being milkers, for example, being splashed by milk when they're changing off the suction cones when they're moving one cow out and moving another cow in. Those things are going to be important. The zoonotic disease standard. Cal OSHA is in love with plans. They just love written plans all over the place. And the zoonotic disease standard requires yet another written plan on top of the injury and illness prevention program, your heat illness prevention program, your respirator protection program, your hazard communication program, on and on and on. And my suspicion from talking to dairy operators is that a great many of them don't necessarily have a written zoonotic disease zoonotic disease plan. And as this rolls forward, most of them are probably going to need to have one in order to be able to demonstrate that they did the things they're required to do, that they looked at these hazards in the context of their own dairies. And that's what I'm trying to do right now, is I'm trying to take what's in the zoonotic disease standard, which, as usual with Cal OSHA standards, is a one size fits nobody, which is kind of particularly smaller employers. It's a little bit like a first cousin of a universal remotes that aren't, and trying to help figure out a program that, again, is not quite finished yet, but figure out a program that's going to work for most area operators in most places. Because when the agency does written programs to provide sample programs to employers, they often put in a lot of bells and whistles that technically aren't required by the standard. So I'm trying to kind of filter out the stuff that the would be nice to do's as opposed to the you really need to do things. And again, that's still kind of a work in progress, but there's a lot of great resources at Cal OSHA that I think people can probably look at those things and figure out The written plans are not, that CalOSHA furnishes are not mandates. They're compliance aids. And so you're not required to do all of those things, but it's also going to be important for producers.
Welcome back as we continue our conversation here today with Brian Little, Chief Operating Officer for Farm Employers Labor Service, which is an affiliated company of the California Farm Bureau. We're talking here today about being proactive and putting a plan in place for bird flu on operations. Once a plan has been put in place here, Brian, can it be flexible at all?
Well, once you put a plan in place, your plan has to be in place for the duration of situations where your employees could be exposed to infected animals. And the concern there, of course, is, the H5N1 has recently become something that can be transmissible from dairy cows to humans. Fortunately, the illness that it causes is relatively mild, some minor upper respiratory symptoms and pink eye. So, nobody's going to die from that. But we also always want to be careful to not expose employees and get them sick in an occupational context. But as long as you're working with infected animals, you need to have a plan for how you're going to prevent employee and manage employee exposures, and how you're going to transition out of that situation once your infection is passed. I guess the thing that I don't know, I'm not sure anybody knows right now, is to what degree does an infection, H5N1 infection, confer immunity on a cow? And are you going to be, my hope is that we're not going to be in this cycle of H5N1 infection and reinfection for the foreseeable future. But to the extent that you are, once you're clear, I guess it's USDA that clears dairies. I'm not sure if it's CDFA or USDA. I think it's USDA, because people I've heard, well, let me put it this way. I talked this week at our annual meeting in Monterey to a turkey producer who recently had to depopulate their entire flock. And they're going to be waiting for clearance from USDA to be able to restock their flock and restock their 6 houses. And I don't know if that's true of dairy cattle or not. I just don't get into that end of how you make the transition out. But I think it's USDA or CDFA, one or the other, has to tell you, okay, you're okay now. You can come out of quarantine and you can start doing normal production things again. And I'm sure you probably know at least what I've learned lately, because I've learned more about dairy operations than I ever knew before I started trying to do this. And that is that in the normal course of their business, they ship cows around a lot. They'll ship the calves off the farm, off the dairy, to another ranch where they raise the calves up to either market weight where they can feed them up to slaughter for the steers, or if they are, or the bulls, or if they're going to be going back into the herd as lactating cows until they get to the age that they're usable for that purpose. But most dairy operations, at least a lot of dairy operations, seem not to do that for themselves. They work with somebody else to do it. And then, of course, once a dairy cow is not providing milk anymore, they usually will send her off to slaughter, or send her off maybe to be fed a little more and then off to slaughter. So that movement of cows obviously creates potential biosecurity problems. And I think everybody's just trying to kind of work through that right now and trying to figure out how much they can maintain normal operations in the industry and still try to control this infection. And I saw the other day that USDA had imposed a requirement that all raw milk has to be tested for H5N1. Pasteurization apparently is a complete kill step for milk, and then cooking beef is a kill step for consumption of meat.
On that, we wrap it up. I want to thank my guests here today, Brian Little, Chief Operating Officer for Farm Employers Labor Service, an affiliated company of the California Farm Bureau. I'm Lorrie Boyer. Sabrina Halvorson is coming up next.
This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. How do humates, and specifically those produced by Live Earth Products, help with greenhouse gas emissions in farming practices?
So the interesting thing is that I like to say it's unique to us, but it's not. Humates and organic matter do a very interesting and very important task in the soil, and that is retain nitrogen. Now, what happens is when farmers apply nitrogen, not all of it is obviously used by the plant. And so some of that nitrogen is lost in multiple ways. It's lost, volatilized, mineralized, or converted. And what happens is some of those converted gases are released as very potent greenhouse gases. And so by the organic nature of humic acids and humates, it helps stabilize that nitrogen, reduce those conversions. Therefore, you get less of those gases created. Now, what's interesting is there's a double dip here, because a lot of times these nitrogen products are created through a process called the Haber-Bosch process. That Haber-Bosch process relies on fossil fuels to create those and fix those nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So by reducing your nitrogen utilization, you also reduce those carbon emissions that are created during the creation of that fertilizer. It's a double dip. You save the fertilizer that you're applying, and you're also reducing your carbon footprint by reducing nitrogen loss.
So with that in mind, tell me a little bit about what exactly Live Earth does.
So typically farmers were using our humates or our liquid humic acids with their nitrogen products. And what that does, it helps stabilize that nitrogen, let that plant get a longer opportunity to use that before that nitrogen is lost, volatilized, or converted. And the technology is not unique just to nut crops. It's used with every nitrogen product. We've got some really neat university trials using our humic acid with a liquid UAN32, and it's a liquid nitrogen that it can be lost in the nature just due to inefficiencies and poor storage in the soil.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
Well, even though we're in between Christmas and New Year's, there's still a lot of news impacting our farmers and the ag industry this time of year. CJ Miller, who is with our news gathering partner Hoosier Ag Today, shares his conversation this week with one of our nation's top ag leaders about two of the biggest ag news stories from earlier last week.
Well, we've been reporting for several years now on the conflict that Mexico created when their former president said he would ban genetically modified corn imports from the U.S. A dispute panel on Friday ruled that Mexico had violated its commitments under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, when it issued those decrees nearly 4 years ago. That's when the first decree was issued. Joining us here today is Ted McKinney. Not only is he a native of Tifton County, Indiana, he's also CEO of the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, or NASDA for short. My first question, Ted, what are your thoughts on the dispute panel's decision on Friday?
Well, in one word, elated. The significance of this decision is untold in its value, because it first reinforced that perhaps the finest trade agreement in the world, and I do believe USMCA is the finest in the world, can stand pressures, can stand its tests, and that good science and common sense, frankly, can prevail, and that's what's happened here. And so people should not just ho-hum this. This is a decision of epic proportion, not just for the U.S. and Mexico, but for the world.
Ted, does Mexico have an appeals process that they can follow at this juncture going forward?
Well, we understand that there is that, but we have not heard from our friends at the U.S. Trade Rep's office what, if any, penalties might be able or might be available to the U.S. should Mexico choose not to abide. So there's a lot of unknown in that, but you have to make sure the decision was made uniformly, unanimously across all 7 points of the complaint, and they were. They ruled in the U.S. favor. And remember, Canada weighed in support of the U.S. claims, so it was really both Canada and Mexico, or Canada and the U.S., making this. So we don't know about penalties or the appellate process, but I think I'll take step one and then deal with step two here in coming months. I think it's very important that we recognize that the U.S. Trade Reps Office, Doug McKaleb, Ambassador Ty, and the whole team really stayed with this. There was at least a question on how committed they would be, and they sure proved themselves in doing that. And I think equally so in the pending Trump administration, the fact that there's quite a force there. Fair trade, not free trade, but fair trade is very much a theme that he and some of his nominees are absolutely promoting. Suggests that there will be quite a price to pay if there's not compliance with all aspects of the complaint.
Ted, I know that you've said the one word you've used is elated. I know that no doubt a lot of other folks, not just within the ag industry, but I've spoken personally with Senator Todd Young. No doubt he's also elated over the decision from the USMCA panel. If the dispute panel had ruled in Mexico's favor, we're talking a huge detriment to the ag economy here in the U.S.
Yes, that's correct. Right now, the penalty, the punishment, the negativity toward U.S. markets has really focused primarily on white corn. There's been and was then the immediate denial of use of white corn for shipment to Mexico, at least biotech white corn for shipment to Mexico. The reason being white corn goes into tortillas and other food grade items. Well, my goodness, if there had been a decision in the opposite manner, it would undermine the entire trust of biotechnology as one of the most valuable tools in the history of agriculture, I believe. And that's why I say elated. And that's why I say this decision is of epic proportion and positively so, I might add.
Ted, in terms of this decision going forward, I know that Claudia Sheinbaum, she's the current president. She succeeded President AMLO. Sheinbaum, the current president, she herself coming from a scientific and engineering background. Do you wholeheartedly agree that she will uphold this ruling and see the science and the value of the decision of the panel?
Well, I think the right answer is it's yet to be determined. You are correct in your assessment. She is a PhD scientist, and one would hope, that background and that knowledge of science would prevail. But let's remember, she is the protege of President AMLO, his acronym. And there was an amendment to the Constitution that could be used to take a cut at the decisions that have been made, the appellate court's decision. So sometimes, believe it or not, politics will oversee or overshadow good, accurate, proven science. And I think that is what we remain to see. That's why I think there's such optimism that the strength of both the current administration and the pending administration will, I hope, prevail and make sure that penalties are seen and are visible if there is noncompliance. But let's remain hopeful. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. I hope that they will look and say, let's just discard this, let's comply with it and get on with other business, because as I think you've been reading, there's a lot more at stake here in the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. for Ms. Sheinbaum to think and worry much about this. I hope they'll just simply comply and get on down the road.
We'll continue with CJ Miller and Ted McKinney right after this. This is the AgNet News Hour, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. We go now back to CJ Miller.
My guest is Ted McKinney, CEO of the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. Ted, I wanted to pivot and ask you about a couple of President-elect Trump's nominations to lead USDA. First, he has nominated Brooke Rollins to serve as the next Ag Secretary. And then here on Monday, it was announced that President-elect Trump has nominated Stephen Vaden. He's a judge on the courts of international trade. He had also served as general counsel for USDA during President Trump's first administration, and he's been nominated to be the Deputy Secretary of USDA. Ted, you served as USDA Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Ag Affairs during Trump's first administration with Judge Vaden. What are your thoughts on both Brooke Rollins and Stephen Vaden being nominated for their respective positions with USDA?
Well, in summary, I think they're both great picks. Starting with Brooke Rollins, I think perhaps the most important thing we in agriculture should look at, and clearly that the president looked at, was to get someone that he trusts completely, that has his ear, and for us in ag, that the vice versa is true, that he has her trust and so forth. And I think that is clearly the case. I mean, her role most recently in the last Trump administration as chair of the Domestic Policy Council, that is no slouch position. Let me just tell you, that is an important role, mostly, oftentimes with daily interface with the then President Trump. So Brooke is great, and she's got some ag chops. Most people may not have heard her much. She's not been in the ag industry solely for her career, but goodness, anybody who starts with a really robust 4-H and FFA experience, as she did, has got my attention. She was a state FFA officer, and remember, Texas is, I can't remember, but it's number 1 or 2 largest association of FFA in the U.S., so there's competition for those roles. And then with student body president at Texas A&M, her degree is in ag development. And then through her time going through law school, leading a not-for-profit, then at the White House, she dealt with ag issues, just not as publicly as perhaps you and I would see, not on the headlines every day. So the fact that she's got those ag chops and has the trust of the president and vice versa is great by me. Moving to Stephen Vaden, I know Stephen well, and he's a good pick. He was the general counsel at USDA, a position that doesn't always get a lot of notoriety, but the man he is a smart cookie. Let me tell you, he knows the law. That was affirmed when he was selected to be the judge of the International Trade Court, and so knows the trade area now pretty thoroughly, at least from a judicial standpoint. He comes from a farm in Tennessee, I believe, Vanderbilt grad. So I think he has a very good and broad perspective that is going to support Brooke Rollins very well. And then we'll just have to see how they continue to surround themselves with undersecretaries and administrators. But no, I'm very pleased with these two choices, and I think they'll serve agriculture not only well, but very well.
Once again, Ted McKinney, CEO of the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. And Ted, thank you so much for sharing your time with us here today on Hoosier Ag Today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, CJ. You too.
That's our show for today. This is the AgNet News Hour. On behalf of Lorrie Boyer and myself, thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Also look for Sabrina Halvorson on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to our podcast by searching for AgNet West on your podcast app. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.